Okay, let's get started. Todd, are you ready? We have Todd Hirsch in the house.
Ready to go.
Perfect. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. My name is Slava Fedosenko, Senior Commercial Asset Manager with Avenue Living and Advisory Panel Lead for Consumer Real Estate Canada. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 5th edition of CREC Talk Shop. The Zoom call will last approximately 45 minutes today, and as always is being recorded to be made available afterwards on our website at www.crec.live. I will ask everyone to please mute their mics at this point. We'll be monitoring the live chat throughout the presentation for any questions and comments from the group, so please type your questions in the chat box at any time. Today's CREC Talk Shop Zoom episode is sponsored by Precision Media and Marketing, servicing the real estate industry, providing measurement, floor plans, photography, videography, and graphic design. Visit them at precisionm&m.com. Without any further ado, today I'm pleased to welcome to CREC Talk Shop a good friend of Consumer Real Estate Canada, Todd Hirsch, the Vice President and Chief Economist at ATB Financial. For over 20 years, Todd has worked as an economist at numerous organizations, including the Canadian Pacific Railway, the Canada West Foundation, and the Bank of Canada. For almost a decade, he taught economics at the University of Calgary. Todd Hirsch is the host of the podcast, The Future Of, an award-winning podcast featuring community and business leaders with insights into a future that is both exciting and often uncertain. Todd is based in Calgary, Alberta, and is a native of Edmonton, and like me, a proud Oilers fan. Todd, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, wonderful to be here. Thank you for asking me to be on the show.
Welcome, Todd. Great to have you here.
And you can see that screen that comes up that says changing the narrative.
Yes, we can see it.
Great. I've got a short presentation that I'm going to share with you this morning, and I'm not going to be too Alberta focused in this because I do know we have folks from outside of Alberta and across the country. But I want to start, first of all, the presentation, Changing the Narrative, New Ways to Think About the Economy in 2022. I want to start, first of all, with a little bit of a story because I always love storytelling. It's a story about a young married couple that were starting out their life together. And as is pretty common during one of the holiday seasons, they decided to do something very traditional, and that is have a roast ham dinner. So they got out the ham, they got out the roaster, and the young bride, she takes a sharp knife and she slices off the tip of the ham. And her husband asked her, "Why do you slice off the tip?" And the young woman says, "Well, that's just the way you prepare ham. You have to cut off the end of the ham. That's the way my mother always did it." Well, they were a little bit curious about the reason for cutting off the tip of the ham. So they called up her mother and they said, "Mom, why is it that you have to cut off the tip of the ham before you roast it?" And her mother says, "Well, that's what you have to do when you make ham. That's what I always do. That's what your grandmother always did in preparing ham. That's the way I learned how to do it." Well, they weren't prepared to drop it at this, so they actually called up the grandmother and they said, "Grandma, why is it that you slice off the tip of the ham before you roast it?" And the grandmother said, "Well, I never had a roasting pan big enough." Now, it's a cute little story. I love telling this story, but I think it's, aside from being a little bit humorous, it's got some instructive lesson for us. And that is, at times we can get stuck thinking about things in certain ways. We can get trapped in narratives about our perhaps baking a ham, but we can also get caught into narratives around our economy. And the danger is if we get stuck in those narratives, it prevents us from moving forward in our economy. I want to share three narratives of the Canadian economy that it is easy to get trapped into. And I want to challenge these narratives and break them down so that we can think about our economy in new ways, new narratives. The first narrative that I want to talk about is that resources are the source of our wealth. Now, this is perhaps a little bit Alberta or Saskatchewan focused, with oil and gas, of course, being the primary driver of a lot of the economy. especially here in Alberta, but also Saskatchewan, Newfoundland and Labrador, and other parts of Canada. It may not be hydrocarbon resources, but other resources like forestry or mining. But it is easy to get trapped into this narrative thinking that resources themselves are the source of our wealth. To challenge this narrative, I'm going to invoke a quote from the father of modern capitalism, Adam Smith, who, in fact, in the book, The Wealth of Nations, he wrote, "It was not by gold or by silver, but by labor that all the wealth of the world was originally purchased." Now, this is a really interesting statement by Mr. Smith over 400 years ago, because he recognized that the resources themselves don't make you wealthy. It's the labor that is applied to them. So with respect to Mr. Smith, I'm going to break down this quote and I'm going to replace certain phrases and certain words so that it's applicable for Canada in the 21st century. We can rewrite it. It was not by oil or by natural gas, but by labor. And in place of that, I'm going to drop in productivity, creativity, innovation, and good ideas. That the wealth of all Alberta, and we can say Canada, was originally created. So now this is a really interesting statement because it challenges the notion that oil and gas is what makes us wealthy. Rather, it's the productivity, creativity, innovation, and good ideas. It's the labor, and particularly the creative labor, that unleashes the value of those oil and gas molecules or the standing timber or the copper and iron ore that this country is so richly endowed with. And it's the distinction is not trivial. A lot of you might be familiar with this t-shirt, "I Heart Canadian Oil and Gas." And with respect to, full kudos to the Canada Action Coalition. They were the ones that, promote these t-shirts. And they do, by the way, they do a great job. I have to give full respect to them. They do a great job in promoting Canadian oil and gas as an industry we should be proud of, that we shouldn't be shirking down and ashamed of it. We should be proud of it. But with permission of the Canadian, this t-shirt, the maker of this t-shirt, I'm gonna just tweak it a little bit to read, "I Heart Canadian Productivity, Creativity, Innovation, and Great Ideas in the Oil and Gas Industry." Because I think if at heart of it, this is what we really love in this country. It's not so much that we love oil and gas molecules, but rather we love that Canadians, and the labor behind it, has been able to unleash these in a way that is more environmentally sensitive and sustainable each day. Now, the distinction or the difference between loving the oil and gas molecules and loving the creativity and innovation, the difference is not trivial, because if it really is the creativity and innovation that we love, this is really good news for Canada, because we can apply that same creativity and innovation pardon me, not just to our energy industry, moving it towards a net zero carbon future, but we can also apply that creativity and innovation in renewable resources, in clean energy technology, in all of those things that the world is getting a little bit impatient, waiting for Canada to take some leadership on. So that is the first narrative that I want to challenge. It's not oil and gas or resources themselves that we love, but rather it's the creative, innovative ideas in our labor force that unleashes those resources and creates the wealth. The second narrative that I want to challenge is the idea that you get a job to earn income. Now, without question, unless you're working as a volunteer, but without question, your income is an important piece of why you're working. Not too many of us would keep working if, in fact, we weren't getting paid. But some of you, if you took economics in university, this little graph might bring back some memories. It might bring back some nightmares, in fact, too. In the middle of the 20th century, around the 1950s and 1960s, labor economists, they wanted to model how does the labor market work? And they came up with this very simple model, which trades off income versus leisure hours. In other words, a worker will decide how much he or she wants to work by how much pay they're getting paid. And they graphed it very simply with leisure hours along the bottom axis there, the x-axis, and income along the top axis. or axis. So the more you get paid, the more leisure hours you're willing to give up. And if you're getting paid less, well, you're going to trade that off for more leisure hours. And that was a very simple way of looking at the world. And in fact, that might have been an appropriate way of looking at the labor market in the 1950s. But I want to argue that, in fact, today it is a much more complicated picture when we think of labor. It's not just income that matters. There's a whole rash of other factors that come into play. I'm going to walk us quickly through the evolution of work-life balance. I'm going to start in the year 1922, 100 years ago. For the average Canadian, this is the way the world of work and life worked. The early part of their life, that blue bar at the beginning, was spent in education. But most Canadians in 1922, average education only probably made it to grade 6 or grade 8. Not, in fact, a majority of people finished high school. That, when you left education, it was followed by a very long unbroken period of time. That was the green bar, that was called work. And then retirement, leisure, was at the end of your life, that red bar. Work was mostly in factories and on farms, not as much office work, not many knowledge workers 100 years ago. Most of the work was very manual and physically intensive. And retirement, that red bar, was a very short period of time. Age 65, in fact, in 1920, they selected age 65 as retirement age when they established the Canada Pension Plan. But they chose age 65 because, in fact, life expectancy was 66. So you see where it left most people. They had, on average, about a year in retirement, meaning that about half of them didn't even live a year in retirement before they died. So retirement, that red bar, was quite a short period of time. But you see this diagram, it's pretty simple. Early life, you're in education. The minute you leave school, you work for a long, long period of time, and then you've got a short retirement. Let's fast forward about 22 years to the end of the Second World War, 1945. Well, now we start to see some changes. Education is becoming a longer period of time as K-12 is becoming more common. And we're seeing more people in retirement as average life expectancy increases. So the blue bar and the red bar both increase. We also see occasional periods of unemployment with the unemployment insurance program brought in by the federal government in 1940. Now, these periods of unemployment marked by those dark red bars, they were occasional. They were usually quite short. Now, the 1930s was different, but in the post-war period, unemployment was usually a short period of time, and the employment insurance program was designed to fill those short and very occasional gaps, those lapses in employment. Let's move to the 1960s and 1970s. Here we see education an even longer period as more and more people are engaging in post-secondary education. Retirement, the other end, the red bar, becoming even longer as Canadians' life expectancy continues to increase. We see the occasional, here we've got 3 bouts of unemployment, which might be typical for an average person. During this period, many more women are entering the job market, which changes the dynamic of the labor force. And also we start to talk about career. Now, I did a little bit of research in this word career. In fact, the word has been around the English language since the 1700s. But my guess is, it wasn't really until the 60s or 70s when we started to think about our jobs, our occupations, as a career choice. I don't know how many people before maybe the 1960s, we didn't really ask kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? My father, he started his job pushing broom in a grocery store in 1955. He was 17 years old. And I asked him, and he went on to have a long career in retail grocery, working his way into senior management. But after he retired, I was asking him about his career in retail grocery. And I asked him, how did you know in 1955 that you wanted to follow a career in retail grocery? And he kind of laughed and he said, we didn't really ask those questions then. We just, you just got a job doing something because you're finished school and you've got to earn some income. And he got a job in a grocery store and worked his way up. But by the 1960s and 1970s, the world starts to change and we become more aspirational about our jobs. And we start to use that word career as if it's a choice. You know, we start to ask children, what do you want to be when you grow up? What feeds your passion? And I think those are good questions to ask. But if you think about it, in the history of humankind, it's only been maybe in the last 50 years or so where we've asked children, what do you aspire to be when you grow up? It's actually a relatively new question. And it changes our relationship with our job by calling it a career as if it's something that we intentionally choose. Retirement is longer, as I mentioned, as life expectancy increases. Let's fast forward now to the 1980s to the year 2000. Well, now we start to see more complexity. We start to see longer and more frequent periods of unemployment, especially in the 1980s and especially in Alberta. As many of you, if you're in Alberta, you might remember the 1980s were a very challenging economic period, where unemployment is no longer just a few weeks, it could be a year or even longer. And the other thing that we start to notice showing up, bouts of unemployment become longer, training and retraining become more common. So those blue bars of education start reappearing as we move through our jobs and our careers. This is the period of what we call lifelong learning, where the expectation on the worker is you might have to do some upgrading of your skills. You might have to take some courses and some training. This is also the period of time where computer technology was rapidly advancing. And a lot of those, especially office workers, were required to take some courses. So they were able to, sort of use these computer terminals that were landing on their desks. So lifelong learning and education as a lifelong process becomes more common. The other really important shift in this period is the idea of parental leave. Maternity and paternity leave starting to become more common as people, and it was helped along, of course, by the federal government in its employment insurance program, allowing maternity and paternity pay. But the idea that you would step away from your job for a period of time, maybe up to a year, where in fact you are caring for young children. That was an important shift in the dynamic of work-life balance in the 1980s to the year 2000. Year 2000 to the year 2020, and I think you can guess why I stopped at the year 2020. We've got one more slide coming, but the first 20 years of the 21st century, things are more complex yet again. We start to see more education showing up, and we also start to see work showing up earlier in life, where it's very common, often expected, that high school or university students would have at least a part-time job in order to pay for some of their tuition or some of their expenses. So you start to see work showing up earlier in life. Care for aging parents, marked by those yellow bars, now later in your career, becoming more common. Just as we might step away from our jobs in order to care for young children, it's becoming much more common for people to step away from their jobs or maybe move to flexible hours or maybe part-time in order to care for aging parents and extended family members. You may choose to take some time off mid-career, perhaps stepping away from your job as a sabbatical or maybe moving to part-time job, willingly or unwillingly. But there is, I think, a greater awareness in the last 20 years or so of, work-life balance requiring more than just being on the rat race of your job, that in fact, you may want to step away from your work for a while for personal development or some leisure time. And then the other important thing that's happening is working after age 65. So we start to see the green bars. Not only are they showing up earlier in life, in education, but they're also continuing after age 65, where more and more Canadians at age 65, they're still healthy, they're still vital, and they want to participate. They're not, most of them not willing to just stop working altogether and drop out, but rather they want a sense of participation. So they may work part-time, they may be engaged in a mentoring kind of role, but that is becoming more common. And then finally, the gig economy, as marked by those three different color green bars near the end or near the beginning of one's work career. Working multiple jobs Now, this is more common among young people, but it's not restricted to young people. But the idea that you might work 2, 3, or even more part-time jobs, these gig jobs, in order to provide income, that became much more common over the last 20 years. And then we get to the year 2022, where we're at now, and look at the complexity involved here. And watch very carefully that the light green bar, which we were calling work in the background. Work from home or work from a remote location. COVID has really accelerated this trend. So rather than a solid green bar, it is now all these variegated shades of green going to white, where location does not matter as much. Now, this was happening before COVID, this idea that you could work remotely, but COVID really accelerated for a lot of workers, the idea that you're no longer tethered to your office. Now, I do have to make the important concession here. Not every worker is able to work remotely. As you're all well aware, workers in retail, as you would say with workers in construction, healthcare, food and accommodation, there are a lot of industries where for those workers, it's not possible to work remotely. They have to be on site in order to do their job. But for many other Canadians, especially those in office or knowledge kinds of industries, work has become much untethered to their cubicle or their office downtown. Whereas, and now workers are not only expecting, but employers are in fact offering more flexibility. So the point I guess I'm trying to make in all of this, if you compare this bar from 2022 and all of the complexities, and you compare that to what it looked like 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, it is no longer just about income, why we work. Our relationship with our jobs has changed fundamentally. Yeah, of course, we're still going to be concerned and interested in how much we're getting paid, but there are all sorts of other considerations that workers are going to look at if in fact they're going to take a job. Considerations such as flexibility in location of where they can work, or flexibility, do they have time off for caring for aging parents or young children? So our relationship with our jobs has changed, and it's no longer just about income. And then finally, the final narrative that I want to get into is that inflation will drive interest rates higher. Now, most of us as consumers are probably noticing, especially I think in food, but also things like gasoline, things like home heating costs. You know, inflation, and this is not restricted to Canada, but inflation around the world is high, the highest it's been in 30 or 40 years. Now, the narrative that we are used to is that when inflation creeps up, we will see central banks fall into lockstep with raising interest rates, because that's the way it's always worked. But in 2022, the picture is not quite as straightforward. I want to describe 4 reasons that are driving global inflation at the moment. The first is obviously supply chain disruptions, a lot of it related to the COVID pandemic. When factories in Asia and other parts of the world, when they went down, it caused a disruption in supply chains. Everything from shipping to rail and trucking, it was all disrupted. And those supply chains, those just-in-time supply chains that we've built over the last 50 years, they actually proved to be remarkably fragile, not as resilient as we would have hoped, because 2 years into the pandemic, we are still dealing with backlogs of items. And probably a lot of you are experiencing that in retail. So that is one obvious reason why we're seeing inflation, because of the supply chain backlogs. If it doesn't make it to the store shelves, that is going to push up price. Another factor, the second factor, has to do with commodity prices. A lot of them food commodities, and a lot of crop failures due to climate change. Now, we do know that increasing rates of flood, fire, heat, drought, all of these things that have stressed crops, not everywhere around the world at the same time, but enough of it over the last 5 years that we've seen commodity prices rising because food crops have failed. And not just related to crops and climate change, but other commodities, notably crude oil, which is currently certainly around $90 US transportation system, which is helping drive up prices for consumers. The third factor, we're seeing this more in the United States at the moment than Canada, but I don't think Canada is too far behind, is that wages are rising. Employers are having a more difficult time attracting workers back to the job. They're having to offer higher wages. Now, I just spent a lot of time talking about how wages and income aren't the only factor, but employers are responding with higher wages in order to try to attract workers back, and they're passing on those higher wages onto the price of their goods and services. So consumers are ultimately paying higher prices. And then the final factor that is driving inflation is some pent-up consumer demand. This is the one most of us are most familiar with. You know, when workers have a lot of money, they're spending a lot of money. It's this whole narrative, you know, fewer dollars or more dollars chasing fewer goods and services, and that drives up price. So, and you see how all four of these, there is some interrelationships between them. They're not in isolation of each other. But these are the four factors really driving global inflation at the moment. But the interesting thing is only one of them, and that is pent-up consumer demand. Only one of them is going to be influenced by higher interest rates. The other three, the supply chain disruptions, the crop failures due to climate change, the higher wages being passed on to consumers, those are not going to be affected when central banks around the world start raising interest rates. Now, this puts the Bank of Canada and other central banks in really interesting situation, because in fact, they have to question, will monetary policy, in other words, raising interest rates, will it be as effective as it's been in the past? And the answer is probably no. Now, central banks are under a lot of pressure to hurry up and do something. Economists and other watchers of the economy that are concerned about inflation getting out of control, they're urging these central banks to hurry up and raise rates. But the central banks know it's not as easy as that. In fact, they have to be very tempered in how quickly they raise rates. So I do think we will see rate increases in Canada starting in March. The Bank of Canada, 2 weeks ago, they took a pass. That actually surprised some industry watchers. But the Bank of Canada's language has changed entirely around inflation. They dropped the word transitory. They used to say, we're seeing some transitory inflation, meaning that, you know, we expect it to go away. Instead, they're using language like, well, price inflation is more persistent and stronger, in fact, than we expected. So we can be certain that the Bank of Canada is going to respond with higher interest rates starting in March, likely 4 more rate increases over the next 12 months. But they are not, in my estimation, they are not going to be responding to inflation as aggressively as they would have in previous periods, because they know, as we just described, their higher interest rates are not going to be as effective at quelling inflation, and they have to, you know, measure that off against the risk of pushing the Canadian economy back into a recession. So just to summarize and then conclude, the three narratives that I challenged. It's not oil and gas molecules or resources themselves that create wealth. Rather, it's the creative, innovative, and educated labor that drives wealth. Employment is about fulfillment and has become much more complex. It's also about income, but it's not exclusively about income. There are other factors at play. And then finally, the inflation pressures may be here to stay, but the Bank of Canada might be reacting less aggressively. They will react, but I don't think we will expect interest rates to rise as quickly or as dramatically as we might have in previous periods or previous bouts of inflation. So with that, I will return to you here. And I'd like to spend the rest of the time, if you have questions or if you have comments of your own, especially if you have comments about what you're seeing in the retail industry. I love hearing those because I don't work in the retail industry, and I would love to hear firsthand what some of you might be seeing, or any questions or comments that you might have.
Todd, what a fascinating presentation. You always give the audience so much to chew on, and we all really appreciate your insights. I'm excited to launch into our Q&A portion, and I'd first like to call on Monica Blahout to ask the first question. Monica, would you like to ask Todd directly?
Sure. Sorry, I thought we were just typing them in. So what I've noticed is a few of my transactions over, say, the last couple months, there have been delays due to bank financing. So can we expect a trend now with banks being a little bit more hesitant to lend out money? Are they worried maybe in fear of interest rates raising and inflation?
Well, that's a great question. And working for a financial institution, you think I would have a much quicker answer. I don't work on that side at ATB Financial in our consumer lending, but I would say this. Banks are actually, especially the big banks, they've actually been one of the keenest, critics of the Bank of Canada in not raising interest rates. They're really hoping that the Bank of Canada hurries up and raises interest rates because banks make money on the spread. And with higher interest rates, those spreads, can widen. That said, I think they will also be a little bit nervous, a little bit cautious about some of those, not all of them, but some consumers who might have perhaps taken on a lot of debt, maybe during COVID, because they know that higher interest rates are going to be a distinct strain on some of those borrowers. So I guess, banks, you'd hope they'd always be vigilant in their lending practices, but I think they will be more watchful. And perhaps a bit more hesitant with some of their consumers who they feel might be at a bigger strain. There's going to be lots of other consumers across the Canadian economy that are actually in really good financial shape. They haven't been spending money during COVID on very many things. Their income probably hasn't been disrupted, and they're going to have a lot of money to spend. I think banks will be happy to finance those, but for those other consumers, I think they will be maybe a little nervous and a little more cautious.
Got it. Can I just have one follow-up question?
Sure.
So if there are modest rate hikes, and this is done throughout the world, is it possible then, or could there be a world recession?
Oh, very easily. This is what a lot of people are kind of warning about. David Rosenberg, I don't know if any of you follow him. He's kind of he's a Bay Street economist, very smart guy. He has a reputation, on the other hand, of being always very negative and pessimistic, always. But he is at the moment warning these interest rate hikes coming by central banks are going to push the global economy back into recession. I don't know if I agree with him entirely on that, but I think his point is they being central banks better be very, very careful and not just sort of go headlong into rate increases, but they have to be very measured about this because in a lot of ways, even though the global economy has bounced back remarkably well in the last 2 years from COVID, a lot of it remains very fragile, and rate increases that come too quickly and too persistently, I think, as David Rosenberg would point out, that is a risk that could push the global economy back into recession. But for now, things generally look like they're in pretty good shape, and I think central banks are going to be watching that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Todd and Monica. Next question, we have Peter Morris.
Hey, Todd, a great presentation today. Thank you so very much for doing that. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, in your presentation, you said that the first rate increase will probably come in March, and then you said you expect 4 more over the next 12 months. So that would be a total of 5 rate increases. Is that what you're saying?
That is what I'm expecting, and I only say that because that's generally what the markets are now that they've priced into. So market watchers, that's what they're saying. I think if the Bank of Canada was uncomfortable with the market pricing that in, I think they would sort of speak up and say otherwise. In other words, the Bank of Canada sends lots of messages. It's not a guarantee that we're going to see 5 rate increases, the first one next month. But I think that's where the Bank of Canada sees the path going. And I think they're okay with market expectations around that.
And to follow up on Monica's question and your comments to her about the possibility of recession, I've heard various bank economists say that they're anticipating a total of 175 basis point increase over the period of time. If that were to tip us into recession, I would imagine then that the Bank of Canada has room to once again reduce interest rates in order to get the economy going. So do you see that this is going to be a back and forth for the near term or mid?
Well, it could. And what I think is more likely is, rather than getting to 175 basis points, would be about 7 rate increases, each of 25 basis points. Rather than that, I would hope, and I trust that central banks, they're going to gauge things as we go along. They're not going to say, well, we're going to plug all 7 of those rate increases in and then wait and see what happens. I think they'll do it in a measured way. So we might not get to 7 rate increases. But in all likelihood, over the next probably 2 years, in all likelihood, we will get to 7 rate increases. That is sort of where central banks like to be, because at the moment, they don't have any rate cuts to allow. In other words, they want to get these interest rates back to what they would consider neutral. They're neither tightening nor loosening. That gives them then some powder in the keg, so to speak. If in fact at a later date the global economy, Canadian economy starts to wane once again, that they have some room to start cutting interest rates. So they are keen to move us back to a neutral interest rate, but I think they are still going to be very careful in how quickly they get there.
Todd, thank you very much for your insights. Great.
Thank you, Todd and Peter, for the question. Next up, I'd like to call on Tim Walsh.
Thanks, Lama. And Todd, I always appreciate your presentations. Always great.
Well, thank you.
In your presentation, there are kind of 2 trends. One is education and great ideas. The other is kind of directly linking to productivity. But in Canada, we've kind of had some of the opposite. We have one of the better educated populations in the world, and yet our productivity constantly lags the US. And in the past it was always kind of blamed on scale, that we couldn't create the scale the US had. I'm not sure that scale argument still holds true in the computer age. Mm-hmm. And I think our political leadership is driving capital more into the US economy and away from Canada. So I guess I'm asking you, for your crystal ball, do you see things improving in Canada because of our education, or do you see more of the same?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And this question of productivity lagging in Canada, this has been something that has sort of vexed economists for as long as I've been an economist, to be honest. They've always been rubbing their hands together saying, productivity growth is lower in Canada than in the United States. Why is that? And there's a lot of, clues that point to, as you mentioned, there's some differences with respect to how governments, treat industries. There's also, one that I kind of buy into. We're not quite comparing apples to apples when you compare the Canadian and US economies. There are enough differences that you have to, sort of question, is the comparison across the two the same? In other words, Canada is much more resource intense than the United States. The United States, much heavier on services. Even things like spending in the US military. Canada is nowhere close to that, but that is a service kind of industry. Whereas when you think of things like our oil sands is a great example. Oil sands, especially, a traditional kind of open pit mining, which over the last 30 years, there's been an enormous amount of investment in. A lot of those projects, it's 10 years of labor without a single barrel of oil coming out of it. And is that enough? Eventually it will, of course, we understand that, but even things like that are perhaps enough to lower Canadian productivity if you just look at a snapshot of it compared to the United States. So, there's other reasons too. I don't know if I sort of believe that the, US government policies or Canadian government policies, lots of people might challenge me on this for sure, but I don't know if the differences are great enough that it's going to affect productivity. Canada, we do have smaller scale. And one of the problems we have, especially in the IT and technology industries, and this is a perpetual problem, we are not short of smart people in Canada when it comes to technology, into the digital industries, AI. But what tends to happen, because we are a smaller player here, is that, you know, some bright young man or woman, they get a great idea and they develop, you know, some app of some sort. And the company in 3 years goes from zero to a $25 million valuation. The next thing you know, someone in Silicon Valley is writing a check for $25 million to this young person who 3 years ago was sleeping on their friend's couch. You know, so how do you tell someone, no, don't take the check. We want to keep these Canadian industries, these knowledge industries here, the really productive ones. So we do tend to face some capital drainage simply because the US is a bigger pond, and those kinds of payments for, you know, something they've built. And then what happens is that young person often stays in Canada, but they go back and start up by, you know, a big player in the US. So it's a traditional problem we have. I don't know what the solution really is, but I think it's another thing that helps explain this productivity gap between the two countries.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Todd. I have one question for you before we wrap. If you're talking to a 17-year-old fresh out of high school about their next steps and they're not sure what to do, how would you try to point them in the right direction?
Oh, that's a great question. And I get a lot of 17-year-olds asking me this, and more so parents of 17-year-olds asking me this. You know, what should Johnny or what should Sally take at university? What's going to get them the best job? You know, there's no answer to that. I would tell any 17-year-old, you know, worry about it a little bit, but don't worry too much exactly which door you go through, because it's more important that you actually follow something that you're interested in. Don't take a program or follow some vocation that you have no interest in just because, you know, the possibility that you're going to get a big paycheck. Follow something you're interested in. Don't worry too much about which direction it's going to go. Your career, and we use that word, you know, thinking about all of the different things that you're going to do in your jobs. It's going to be a zigzag path. It's not going to be like my dad's job was. It's not going to be like jobs in 1922. It is going to be very dynamic. You're going to be all over the map. The most important thing is you remain a positive-minded person and that you work hard, but don't stress too much about which door you go through. But it is important you grab a doorknob and go through one of them.
Todd, thank you so much. And with that, we'll wrap. What an incredible presentation and answers. On behalf of everyone at Consumer Real Estate Canada, thank you so much for sharing your time and wisdom with us today. And thank you to everyone who joined us. Today's CREC Talk Shop Zoom episode was sponsored by Precision Media and Marketing. You can visit them at precisionmnm.com. Todd, thank you again. Please watch for details via email on the next CREC Talk Shop session. Hope you have a great rest of your week. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much. Be well.